We were in John 4 talking about the woman in the well, and during that conversation a few weeks ago, we talked about Jesus' response, and he said God is searching for or seeking true worshipers. And in that, so we went to look at what it meant to worship last week, and it was a fairly negative message. A lot of it was, that's just the way the scripture goes. We talked a lot about false gods, false ways of worshiping God, and we're going to briefly highlight a couple of those, but that's just, the Bible is filled with mostly, let's face it, every one of these books in here has a negative aspect of false worship and, believers who just can't get it right. So that was the focus last week, and I kind of thought, I didn't want to end it there, because there's more to worship than just, highlighting the negative. So let's talk about the positive this week. And there was one spot during last week where we had a little glimmer of light, and that was in Romans 12. So I decided let's focus on Romans 12 to learn a little bit more about this positive side of worship. And I think this will be helpful because, like I said, we learned about negative worship and ways not to do it, but it's helpful to know about ways to do it, worship. And we always assume, not always, but I think many of us kind of assume growing up in the church for so long that everyone just kind of knows what worship is, and it's not always the case. And a lot of people don't want to ask. It's a little, off-putting to have to ask someone, what does worship mean, right? So that's where we're going to focus today. I do want to kind of highlight, if for those of you that weren't here maybe, and for those that you were, we're going to kind of run over real quick where we were last week. And I'll probably do this with my glasses on and off several times because I can never seem to find a comfortable place, whether reading them or not reading them, looking up and all that. So try not to be distracted by that. You may remember last week we said there were three main areas of false worship. Four, but we'd only talked about three. The first one being false gods, and most of us in America don't really worship false gods too much. Especially in this congregation, I don't think we have to worry about that. We will deal with that in another text at some other time, but this week we're going to deal with, last week we dealt with the wrong forms of worship, the true God. So real quickly, the first one we looked at was the worship of the true God in the wrong form. We talked about the golden calf. Focusing our attentions wrongly on an object, although we're thinking about God. And we talked about paintings that people have and images of Christ. We talked about the toast that came up with a picture of Jesus burned on the side, and then the lady burned her tortilla, and they put it in a glass case, and everyone came over and began to worship it. And we also talked about atheists also worship. They worship their self or the creation. Well, they would call it evolution, and we went to talk about that in the science. They worship anything, basically anything that's not God. Yeah, I'm going to go back and forth with these things. But we said that God does not want us to think of an image when we think of worshiping Him, because He doesn't want us to think of Him as part of the creation. He is above the creation. He is transcendent, right? So that is, He's outside, and this is by design. We said God did this on purpose. That was number one. Number two, we worship the true God in a self-willed way, wrongly. So we talked about David and Uzzah and putting the ark on a cart. And David would have ordered Uzzah to put the ark on a cart, but they learned this from the Philistines, if you might remember. We talked about the Philistines, and they had the ark when they'd taken it from Israel in battle. And then to them, they don't know anything about our order of worship, so they put it on a cart, sent it back after all the plagues. And Israel realized, hey, this kind of works. We don't have to carry this thing around. But Uzzah's line, his whole purpose in growing in service to temple worship was to carry it. And we learned that Moses even talked about giving carts for this group, giving carts for that group. But to these guys, they weren't to have carts because they were to carry the holy things on their shoulders. Uzzah knew that. He should have now said something to the king, but for his irreverence in God, he was struck down when it looked like the ark was going to fall, and Uzzah put his hand up to touch it, to stop it. That's a wrong way to worship. That's self-willed. We also looked at Aaron's sons who offered strange fire to the Lord where they weren't commanded to, and God killed them. And our third point was the true worship of the true God the right way with the wrong attitude. And here we address many false teachers who would only have us worship by emotion, by disengaging our mind. And we showed you how Job connected our inner spirit with our mind. So our hearts and mind are connected in worship. We don't get rid of knowledge just to worship by emotion, and a lot of teachers would have us do that. And Paul points out how there are some who are zealous for their worship, but they have no understanding or no knowledge. So we concluded all this by saying we raise our thoughts about Him. We elevate our worship. The higher our thinking of God, the higher our worship goes. And that is what He seeks, right? Jesus said in John 4, as our parent text where we've trailed off over here, the Father seeks such people to be His worshipers. And this talks about salvation, right? The Father is seeking those to worship Him. Those that are being saved are worshipers. True worship then is that's what bubbling over from the change that's already occurred on the inside. And we're going to hear this theme a lot throughout the weeks. So we're going to transition into Romans here, where Paul talked about, after 11 amazing chapters of addressing the Jews, addressing the Gentiles and the differences and all that, and all the mercies of God. And finally in chapter 11, he gets to the redeeming of the true Israel and redeeming of the Gentiles. But he now transitions in chapter 12 to engage our minds, to engage our bodies and our souls into the true service of worship. And this he does to teach us how to become true worshipers, and that's the title of today's message, True Worshipers. Go ahead and turn to Romans 12. And it's very short, very short. It's just one verse. If you're there already, can't read it. Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And that's our text for today. Your bulletin will show you, it'll have point 1 and subpoints. Well, we've kind of broken off onto a different sidetrack here. In Romans 12, 1 and 2, you're going to see, if you look at it, you'll see 3 natural points of interest, like an outline, almost a natural outline. The first one would be present your body as a living and holy sacrifice. Look down to the next one, do not be conformed to this world. That would be point 2. And point 3 would be transformed then by the renewing of your mind. We can conclude the last half of the second verse might be the result of the first 3. All of which would be the positive result of proving what the will of God is, right? The will of God, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. That's the end of verse 2. So what we're going to do today is we're not going to go through all those. We're just going to go through the first part, the first verse, present your body as a living and holy sacrifice. And we're going to break that down even further. So now we're too deep. We're 2 levels deep into this thing. Have you ever seen that movie Inception, where they have a dream and a dream and a dream, and then even a 4th dream? Well, we're only 2 levels down at this point. Maybe 3. I can't remember anymore. And today you're going to see presenting, first of all, what I'm going to call thankful worship. And we're all based on the text. Present your body as a living and holy sacrifice. The second one would be living worship. And the third one would be holy worship. And that's set apart. But look at the text. Present your bodies. This is a call to action. Paristema. That is to place beside. To present. To bring it to something. You're bringing something to something. This call to action is more than a call to just come to church. Right? We think of, well, we're going to go worship, we're going to go to church. This is more than that. This is a call to bring ourselves to God in worship. Not just to the building. to get points. As my favorite actor, Tim Allen, said on one of his TV shows, well, I showed up today, that means I scored some points with God. That's not the case. True worshipers, then, are presenting thankful worship. And I'm going to illustrate this to you right here. Not only is this our first point, but I would go so far as say the entire point of this whole little passage, these two verses, is summed up in this one sentence. True worshipers are presenting thankful worship. You could say that. The English word there, bodies, I think does a little bit of an injustice to the text, to the meaning. Because that's just speaking about our physical representation, right? Our bodies. Be thankful with your body. Well, what does that mean? Look at the Greek word. If you don't have I don't know how I can tell you that because you don't have a way to look at it, but I'm going to tell you what it is. It's soma. This has the idea, and this is really interesting. This is a small number of closely united men. Okay? So the word for bodies in the Greek is a small number of men closely united. And the root of this word means to keep safe, to save a suffering one. Think about that. To save a suffering one, to keep them safe. Small number of closely united men. This is the body, right? The body of Christ. This is how we're united. So that describes believers then. That's a description of what we are. So then when you're presenting yourselves as one who is saved. So we're a group of believers, you could say, closely united, saved from suffering, and that speaks of those who are receiving salvation. So then we are a group of believers who offer up praise and adoration to our God who is saving us. Psalm 50:14, offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving and pay your vows to the Most High. The second one, Psalm 69:30, I will praise the name of God with song and magnify him with thanksgiving. True worshipers, then, are those who are bringing themselves before the Lord with thankful hearts as those being saved. Well, what does this mean to people who are trying to get unbelievers to worship God? They have no idea what they're worshiping. That's really something to think about. Because this has implications across multiple ministries. How can someone be thankful to a God they don't even know? Or why they should be thankful? We'll see in a minute that we offer ourselves a living sacrifice. That's as someone who has been snatched out of the fire. But not for atonement. We're not offering ourselves our daily living as an atonement for our sins. That's already been paid for, right? That's already been bought. 1 Corinthians 6:20, for you have been bought with a price, therefore glorify God with your body. That's a picture of daily living as an ongoing act of worship. And that's where we're going. This is point number 2. As we said, true worship then, and true worshipers are those that are thankful as an ongoing act of daily living. It's a part of our daily lives. So our next point in living worship, not only do we present ourselves thankfully, but also notice as living sacrifices. We are daily presenting ourselves as living proof. You could say living evidence. This is living proof of the continual change that's already occurred. Like we keep saying, baptism is the greatest and easiest example for me to show you. Nothing happens at the baptism. You're not saved when you're dunked in the waters. But you're demonstrating physically to the world what's already happened on the inside. And Paul says in Romans 6:16, do you not know? He's talking about this. When we present ourselves as slaves, we do so as slaves in obedience to that which we serve. So keeping one thing in mind, this is not talking about someone who commits a one-time sin or an occasional sin, nor does it give us excuse to sin, right? No excuses to sin. But this is talking about the one who practices a life of perpetual sin. But it works both ways. It's positive and negative. The sinner practices a life of sin. They don't even think about it. They don't go out and Well, they can go out and pick and choose what sins they're going to do, but a believer doesn't do that. You don't pick which fruit you're going to bear. Well, I think I'm going to love someone today. Maybe I'll be nice. You do that because that's who you are. And we're going to get to it in a little while, but I don't want to jump ahead of myself. That's a good example. But why do I say perpetual? Because Paul says these things lead to death. Right? He reiterates Jesus' teaching, perpetual sin leads to death. Romans 6:21, therefore, what benefit were you then deriving from the things of which you were now ashamed? So now you're a believer. You're ashamed of those things in the past. Why do you hang on to them? For the outcome of those things is death. So serving sin then equals eternal death, referring to the final state of our eternal destination. That's the negative side. There's always the negative side, but the positive side is the believer has spiritual life, and that leads to eternal life, right? This is the fruit of those who through the power of God become obedient from the heart. Now, this is not something that you just do because you're trying to earn your way into heaven. I know that I've said that so many times in the past few months. This is not of our own power, not of our own strength. I'm going to give you an example. A tree. We talked about bearing fruit a second ago. We bear fruit of the power of God. So if you're a believer, you're going to bear the fruit. A tree bears fruit. What does it do to bear that fruit? Does it do anything? Well, I need to make an apple today. I think I better get to work. It's kind of early in the morning. I guess I got time. The tree bears the fruit because that's what is growing inside of it. That's what comes from the inside. The tree doesn't do anything to bear the fruit. It simply is doing what's already happening inside of it. Likewise, as a believer, we work as the change is growing inside of us. This is what God has already done inside of us. But this is to say that if we try to do it on our own, Jesus warns us about this, keeping the law on your own. If you're going to do it, you're going to try to make it in there on your own. But that means apart from Him. I don't want to believe in that stuff. I don't want to become a Christian. Okay, I can be a good person. Well, the problem with that is, if you're going to keep the law, you have to keep it all the time. Remember, perpetually, continually. And not just all the time, all the time. Every single law, all the time, all the time. I can't say it enough. If you break one, even one time, you're guilty of the whole entire thing. And your eternal destination is accordingly. So we are who believe, or like the author of Hebrews says, that the power to live is continual obedience. We do so through Christ. Hebrews 13:15, he says this, through Him then, that's Christ, let us continually offer up sacrifice of praise to God. Turn to Leviticus 6 real quick. Leviticus 6 will demonstrate this example. I want you to see how this is illustrated in the life of a priest. Verse 9. I don't know where my glasses went. Oh. Command Aaron and his sons, saying, this is the law for the burnt offering. The burnt offering itself shall remain on the hearth and on the altar all night until the morning. And the fire on the altar is to be kept burning on it. Skip down to verse 12. The fire on the altar shall be kept burning on it. It shall not go out. But the priest shall burn wood on it every morning, and he shall lay out the burnt offering on it, and offer up in smoke the fat portions of the peace offerings on it. Verse 13. Fire shall be kept burning continually on the altar. It is not to go out. So what's the point of all that? Not that we make sacrifices. We don't do that anymore. That ended when Christ came and ripped the veil from top to bottom. But we worship always. But not just in the church. If we worship God rightly, as I've been saying, if we worship God and we think about God rightly, we can be out in the world and see a truth of God, and it begins the worship in our mind, doesn't it? How many times have you been out in public and you see something and you go, man, that's a God thing? That is just, you're standing there and at the bottom of the mountain and you look up and you go, the truth is just, it starts permeating through you and the worship pours out as a blessing. I want to read to you from John Calvin. He had this to say about this text in Leviticus. It's very interesting. John Calvin, he's very wordy. And he was from Geneva. And so he's preached over 5,000 sermons. He's got lots to say about stuff. I couldn't even imagine 5,000 sermons. He says this about Leviticus 6. The intent of and I'm going to give you the English version after I'm done reading it. The breakdown. The intent of this perpetuity was that the offerings, he's talking about the offerings of the priests in Leviticus 6, that the offerings should be burnt with heavenly fire, for on that day, the day that Aaron was consecrated, the sacrifice was reduced to ashes, not by human means, but miraculously in the token of approbation. And he's just taught, it's a fancy word just to say that God approved of it, right? God approved of this burning, this offering. Calvin continues, true that God did not choose daily to exert this power, but he interposed the hand and labor of men in such a manner that the origin of the sacred fire should still be from heaven. So in English, the point is the same as we've been saying. God grants us the power from within to be obedient in service if we're living inside his will. These priests were living in Leviticus 6 inside the ordinations of God. The point Calvin made about God consuming the sacrifice with Aaron was to show us that, yes, God does act supernaturally. But because he doesn't act supernaturally sometimes does not mean his hand is not on it. He's showing you that the priests had the power to do this every single day, the exact same way, the prescribed way, all the time, by his power. Remember the tree with the fruit? The tree doesn't need God to step in every single morning and go, okay, tree, start bearing fruit now. It's 9 o'clock. You're late. It does it anyway because he does that. That's the power of God. And we don't always see this working power, but it's there. And that's what Calvin is saying. This is the power of God worked out in the life of every believer. And we see that with our example with the tree. And we see it with the Levitical priests. And this is what the ancients always got wrong. The Philistines and all these other groups, they always got wrong. They think they had to appease a God to please him because he wants a service performed to be happy. So he doesn't destroy mankind. That's why all the Greeks and the Romans, they had all these different things, and they have Aphrodite, and they would fight, and whoever won, there would be either famine for 7 years, or there'd be feast for 7 years. And even atheists of this day get it wrong because they think that we come here to appease our God. If we don't come to church, then God's going to strike us down. That's what atheists think. So we're just doing what we're doing because we believe this. This is not what we believe. We believe that the loving kindness of God supplies us with the power, the staying power, the holding power to be faithful, to be obedient in service and worship. And like Peter says in his first letter, chapter 2, and I think I wrongly said verse 5 earlier, I think it's verse 15, your note will probably tell you. And Peter says this, you also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. That sounds like a long list of religious slang. He's saying this, priests, us, offering up sacrifices, that's worship, accepted by God through our faith in Jesus Christ. That's what he's saying. Notice even our faith is supplied by God. Well, where do you get that, Jeff? Where does it say our faith is being supplied by God? Look at the first part of that verse, and we'll just listen to it again. You also, as living stones, are being built up. Built up by who? Yourself? Is he saying, pat yourself on the back because you're doing a great job? No. He's saying you're being built up as a spiritual house, a temple, for a holy priesthood. And we're going to get into holy in a second. We're going to analyze all these little religious words. The priesthood, that's us, Christians, believers, offered up as spiritual sacrifices, worship. And that's where this is going. We're being built up to worship. Like the priests of that day, priests offered up sacrifices. Think about this. The average person back in those days, did they walk right into the house of the temple and start worshiping God? No. They brought their sacrifice, their animal, to the priest. The priest slaughtered the animal. And then the priest offered the sacrifice on the altar. It burned and it offered to God. We skip that whole process now. We offer our worship right to God. And He accepts it. If it's true. And it starts with believing in Christ. And that brings us to our third point. We're cooking right along. Speaking of worship. Holy worship. That's point 3. So far, I'm going to quickly summarize this. And I think you're going to like this section the most. So far, we've seen that we are worshipers that we worship in thankfulness to God, who's saving us from the wrath against our sin, right? To Jesus Christ for dying in our place. We're thankful to Jesus Christ for dying in our place, raising us to new life, and as He was also raised from the dead. We believe that. That's what we are as a believer, and that's why we're thankful. Secondly, we offer daily worship. That's continual. By living like those who have been transformed or born again, as we said in John 3. Remember He said to Nicodemus, you who are born again, you must be born again to see the kingdom of God. This shows up as continued power through us, remember, not by us. And finally, the third point here is our worship is holy. Holy sacrifice. What does that mean? First, I want you to see that He connects living and holy worship together. Look at the verse. Present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice. Okay? Didn't really help me with that one, Jeff. Holy, hagios, means sacred, consecrated. What is holy? Is that helping much? Sacrifice means what is consecrated, offered to God. That didn't help either, did it? So, I'm going to help you out here. Holy means set apart, separateness, dedicated. Each of us know, like, okay, you got money in your bank account. This money right here is dedicated to the car payment. This money is dedicated to the guy who always asks me for $5 every time I see him. But I'm going to give you a couple biblical examples. Exodus 29:33, and they're pretty short. Well, this one's really short. Speaking of Aaron's sons as priests, they're talking about the offering was made, and then someone's going to eat something. It's the point you'll see. I think you're going to connect the idea separate with holy. So they shall eat these things, and by which the atonement was made at their ordination and consecration. Don't let all those things fool you. What they're talking about here is they shall eat it. This was consecrated for Aaron's sons. They're going to eat it. The next part is, but a layman shall not eat them, because why? They are holy. They're set apart for Aaron's sons. Therefore, they're holy. Just like Uzzah, his service was set apart from everyone else's with the cart. That's why Uzzah didn't get to the cart. He had to carry it on his poles. So you can see how set apart, this is what holy means. I'm going to give you one more example, and this is kind of fun. I mean, I think so. The religious word, we're talking about religious words for a little bit here. The phrase is really simple, Holy Bible. What does that mean? Holy, well, we learned holy is set apart, so that's one down. The other one is Bible. It means book. That's it. Holy Bible. Set apart book. Sorry about that. Most books are titled by what's written in them, right? If you've got a dummy right here who wants to know about accounting because he doesn't know anything about accounting, well, I can do two things. One, I can go to Mark's house and talk to him, or I can go to the bookstore and look up the book that's called Accounting for, guess what? Dummies. And that would be me. They would be like, oh, look, there's your book, Jeff. It's right there. I found this really short list of interesting, well, they say they're interesting titles, and they say that this helps people get the book because they think just because of the title that they're gonna want it. It's just a little side deal. This isn't really, it's a freebie. Your favorite. First one, I'm only going to do 3 because, the list is long and I don't want to waste your time. Number 1, do androids dream of electric sheep? Yeah. I actually said that in first service and I learned something about that. I just thought that was a random title, but apparently that was what spawned the movie Blade Runner. So, if you're ever interested, there you go. Number 2, everything I never told you. And I'm thinking, I don't want to know. Number 3, is everyone hanging out without me? And other concerns. Sounds a bit neurotic. I don't think I need to know about that book either. But listen to this. The Bible is a book that's titled completely different. It's the only book that I can find anywhere researching it that the title doesn't describe what's in the book, but it describes itself about books. And it refers itself to, it compares itself among other books. And not only other books, it compares itself among all books. Think about it. Set apart book. In the Bible, we talked last week about the Philistines, how they brought the Ark of God, right, to their camp after taking it from the Israelites. What happened to the statue, Dagon? The next morning they woke up, the statue was face down on the ground. They picked it back up. Next morning, the statue was on the face down on the ground. This time its head and its hands were cut off. God was making a mockery out of them. Well, if you title your book, and God wrote a book, and I do believe he wrote this book, if God wrote a book, and he did, that's titled Set Apart Book, guess what it better be? It better be set apart. So let's find out how set apart this book is or is not. Listen to this. In 1815 to 1975, 2.5 billion copies printed. That outdoes any book in history. And that doesn't even include from 1975 to now, which is 46 years. I know that because I'm born in 74. Scholars in the book industry say that they can't even calculate how many Bibles have been printed for all history, but their conservative guess is 5 to 6 billion copies. Only China even tries to come close, and they don't make it, with their printing of their this Mao Zedong, the communist regime. They're trying to push their agenda down their own people's throats. But each year, over 100 million copies, every single year, over 100 million copies of the Bible are bought and sold and given away freely. In a world of 7,000 languages, the New Testament has been translated 2,191 times. Of that, the Old and the New Testament together has been translated into 698 languages. The next highest level of translated books in history would be the book called The Little Prince and Pinocchio. And the highest number they get to is 382 and 300 respectively. If you want to Google this and you search out these things, when you go to look out the most printed book in history, most of the articles that you're going to read start like this, something like this. Well, we know that the Bible has outdone everyone in history, so we're not even going to start there. We just start at the next best thing. Harry Potter, about 150 million copies. And then they start counting down from there. It's out there by a long shot. But we're not done. And we are getting close to being done, but we're not done with that point. When we talk about the number of copied manuscripts, now this is what we're talking about as far as historians, they know that the original copies, you can't keep them forever. They're going to deteriorate. They're going to get lost. Something happens. Some tribe comes in and wipes them out, and they take their stuff. They're talking about copies, numbers of copies of manuscripts, right? Homer's Iliad, until recently, was thought to have the highest number of copies, 642 copies of the original. The New Testament, there's copies of the entire New Testament, ranges over 5,000 copies. And if you want to talk about fragments, just pieces of those things, over 25,000 plus fragments of the New Testament. And many of them dating to between 30 and 40 years to the original writing. Homer's Iliad, 642 copies, the number one in all of antiquity besides the Bible. The nearest copy was the first original copy made after the original was written was 1,000 years. That's the best the world has to offer. The number one best. Answer the question. Did God have the chutzpah to knock them all down? You better believe it. And he says that, you better believe it, doesn't he? Setting apart is putting it mildly. I think holy is the better term, is the better word. Set apart, but notice not removed from the world. This book right here, you don't have to go to the cult down the street to find it. You don't have to go to the nearest guy selling shenanigans to go get the copy of this thing. You can get this at Target. You can get this almost at Tom Thumb. Hotel rooms got them. Well, those are given away for free. Doesn't really count. I mean, maybe it does, but you don't have to go somewhere secret to get it. You don't have to remember the club. It's in the marketplace. God competes right there in the marketplace, and that's the point of the whole thing. I wasn't just talking about the Bible as an outstanding book just to, build up your confidence, which hopefully it does. But at the same time, this book is competing in the marketplace. We're going to get to a little bit more of that in a second. Turn to Deuteronomy 18 for just a moment, and we're almost there. I promise you. Deuteronomy 18. Verse 9, if you just want to listen to this. When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, you shall not learn to imitate the detestable things of those nations. Verse 13, we're just going to skip down a little bit. You shall be blameless before the Lord your God. For those nations which you shall dispossess, listen to those who practice witchcraft and diviners. But as for you, the Lord your God has not allowed you to do so. So he's saying here, you can be out there in the world, but you are not to be conformed to that world. Now I want to take a quick note about that. I said last week about the narrative being the normative, and I said that last night, Wednesday night, I think. I was kind of struggling for examples. Right here in Deuteronomy, right here in 18, it talks about when you enter the land which the Lord your God is giving you. A lot of people will take something that's in the Bible, a narrative like this, and God's giving them this. And they go, oh, that means we're supposed to do that as Christians. We're supposed to take over the world. We're supposed to do this, do that, take over the 7 mountains, right? The 7 points of society, entertainment, this and that, all those. That's not what we're to do. That's Seventh-day Adventist, in case you're wondering. God's not saying, and I'm just giving you this instruction because a lot of times we want to take something like that from the Old Testament and apply it right to ourselves. There is a truth in here. The truth of this passage is God saying you can be out in the marketplace with your theology that you're learning, with your thoughts about God, and you can compete in the marketplace of ideas with your theology and your learning of the truth of God. You don't have to remove yourself. And that's the point of the passage. It's instructive about how we are to live. How we're to live among the people. Not in our own little Christian cults where we only watch Christian TV, we only listen to Christian radio, only listen to Christian songs, newspaper and websites. It's not bad to have those things. Sometimes they build us up. When we're having a bad moment or something, we go listen to something that helps elevate our minds and our hearts. Or maybe we have a question about something, so we go to a Christian website to go, well, what does God say about that? And these guys been studying their whole lives and they got the answers for it. Great, go learn it. But we're not to isolate ourselves to these things. We're to live in the marketplace of ideas and compete. That's what God does. He competes right there. And I think when you're bold and you live as a Christian, you don't have to go bash everyone on the head that you know or even that you see. A lot of the street preachers, I see a lot of guys doing that. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with street preaching. But everyone that walks by, they just say, you're going to hell, you're going to hell, you're going to hell. There may be truth to that, but he doesn't know everyone walking by. He's not really competing in the marketplace of ideas. He's just kind of shouting at people. And I love what John MacArthur said about that once. He says, don't think for a second that you can't get punched in the mouth for being a Christian. Right? We don't have to be jerks. But I think that we can be bold. And there's times where I've said things from this pulpit where I would not say things in my past. I would be nervous to say things. And I'm starting to see change in myself. Stepping out and saying the things I might not used to necessarily do. And I hope that you guys will do that too, because when you do that, you'll be viewed. And look, the world watches us. They're waiting to see how you're going to react when you lose your job for no reason. How did you react when this happened to you? Did you just lose your mind? But we want to be a people that are regarded as true worshipers. So how do we make ourselves into a living sacrifice in front of a watching world without conforming to our surroundings? Well, for that, you have to come back next week. We'll talk about it then. Let's pray.